Now, our 67th fact: home games influence published design. Game designers aren't just creating in isolation, they're also players who participate in home games, and they're observers who pay attention to how their games are actually used. When a published rule consistently causes confusion or frustration at actual tables, future editions address the problem. When a house rule becomes nearly universal across many gaming groups, publishers sometimes incorporate it into official rules. When certain play styles become popular, new products support those styles. The relationship between professional game design and home play is bidirectional. Published materials influence how people play, but how people actually play influences what gets published. Home games are laboratories where ideas are tested, where innovations emerge organically, where the living practice of play shapes the official products. Our 68th fact notes that non-Western fantasy reframes default assumptions. For decades, fantasy RPGs defaulted to pseudo-medieval European settings. But increasingly, games draw inspiration from other cultures: African mythology, Asian folklore, indigenous American traditions, Middle Eastern histories. These non-Western fantasy settings challenge assumptions about what fantasy must look like. They expand the palette of available tropes, aesthetics, and themes. They reveal that many things considered inherent to fantasy, like feudalism or specific monster types or particular magic systems, are actually culturally specific rather than universal. This expansion enriches the genre, offering new possibilities while also prompting reflection on why certain assumptions became defaults in the first place. Non-Western fantasy doesn't replace European-inspired settings, it exists alongside them, creating a more diverse and interesting fantasy landscape. Our 69th fact reveals that fantasy RPGs influence modern fantasy fiction. The influence doesn't flow in just one direction, from fiction to games. Increasingly, fantasy RPGs influence the novels, films, and shows that follow them. Writers who grew up playing RPGs incorporate gaming sensibilities into their fiction: ensemble casts with complementary abilities, progression through challenges that build toward climactic confrontations, magic systems with clear rules and limitations. Some novels explicitly adopt RPG-style structures, with characters gaining levels or unlocking skills. The popularity of lit RPG as a sub-genre fiction that incorporates game mechanics directly into the narrative demonstrates how thoroughly gaming has influenced fantasy literature. Fantasy RPGs have become not just consumers of fantasy fiction, but contributors to the genre's evolution. And finally, our 70th fact: genre feedback loops keep the style alive. All these elements, market forces, cross-media influence, fan creativity, bidirectional relationships between design and play, diversifying cultural sources, create feedback loops that sustain fantasy role-playing games as a vibrant, evolving cultural phenomenon. Success breeds investment. Investment creates content. Content attracts participants. Participants create more content, and the cycle continues. The loops aren't closed systems. New influences enter constantly, new creators bring fresh perspectives, new audiences demand different experiences. But the core dynamics remain, ensuring that fantasy RPGs continue to grow, change, and thrive as both hobby and cultural force. These feedback loops are why fantasy role-playing games aren't a passing fad from 1970s, but an enduring form that continues to capture imaginations decades after their inception. So, as you relax even more deeply, breath slowing, mind quieting, consider this. Fantasy role-playing games exist within vast cultural ecosystems. They influence and are influenced by countless other creative works and communities. They're not isolated hobby activities, but nodes in a network of imagination that spans media, crosses borders, and connects millions of people through shared love of fantastic worlds and collaborative storytelling. Segment 8, Why It Lasts. Welcome to our final segment in this journey through the world of role-playing games. As you rest comfortably, breathing gently, let's explore why fantasy RPGs have endured for so long, why they continue to captivate new generations of players, and what makes them so deeply meaningful to those who play them. Our 71st fact reveals that fantasy accommodates endless reinterpretation. The core elements of fantasy, magic, adventure, heroism, wonder are flexible enough to support countless variations. You can reimagine elves as cybernetic constructs in a post-apocalyptic world, and they're still recognizably elves. You can set your campaign in a city where all the traditional fantasy races live side by side in an urban environment, and it remains fantasy. You can make dragons misunderstood environmentalists rather than greedy monsters, and the fundamental fantasy dynamic still works. This flexibility means fantasy never becomes exhausted. Each generation, each gaming group, each individual game master can reinterpret the tropes to reflect contemporary concerns, personal interests, or simply the desire to see something familiar from a new angle. Fantasy bends without breaking, accommodates without losing its essential character, endures because it can constantly become new, while remaining itself. Now, our 70-second fact. Familiarity speeds play. Creativity keeps it fresh. We've explored this tension throughout our journey, but it's worth revisiting as we consider longevity. The familiar elements of fantasy, the recognizable tropes, the established conventions, the shared vocabulary make it easy to start playing. New players aren't overwhelmed. Experienced players can jump into new campaigns quickly, but familiarity alone would eventually become boring. What sustains interest over years or decades is creativity, the unique twists, the unexpected interpretations, the personal touches that make each campaign distinct. The balance between familiar and fresh is what keeps people coming back. They know what to expect in broad strokes, which creates comfort and accessibility, but they never quite know what specific surprises await, which creates excitement and anticipation. This balance is remarkably difficult to achieve, but fantasy manages it naturally. Our 73rd fact observes that ensemble storytelling sustains long campaigns. Role-playing games are inherently collaborative. No single person carries the entire weight of making the experience interesting or meaningful. When one player's character arc reaches a natural pause, another player's character can step into focus. When the game master runs low on inspiration, player choices generate new directions to explore. When someone at the table contributes a particularly creative idea, everyone benefits and builds upon it. This distributed creative responsibility means campaigns can continue for years without exhausting any single person. The ensemble nature of the storytelling distributes both labor and reward, making long-term play sustainable in ways that would be impossible if everything depended on one individual's continued enthusiasm and creativity. Our 74th fact celebrates that player agency keeps worlds alive. A fantasy world in a novel exists only as the author describes it. Once you finish reading, the world becomes static, frozen at the moment the story ends. But fantasy worlds in role-playing games live and change based on player choices. The kingdom the party saved in one campaign might fall into corruption during the next. The dragon they defeated might have offspring seeking revenge years later. The tavern they frequented might be run by the children of the original proprietor when characters return decades later in game time. Player agency means the world continues to evolve, to respond, to develop. This ongoing life makes the world feel more real, more meaningful. It's not just a stage set, it's a place that exists independently, that has history and future, that remembers what happened and changes because of it. Now we arrive at our 75th fact. Fantasy worlds feel worth saving. Many campaigns involve high stakes, stopping invasions, preventing apocalypses, defeating tyrants, saving kingdoms, or even entire worlds. These stakes work emotionally because fantasy worlds are vivid, detailed, populated by characters players care about. The world doesn't feel like an abstract concept, it feels like a place filled with innocent people living their lives, places of beauty and meaning, possibilities for joy and growth. When that world is threatened, the threat feels personal. Players aren't just engaging with mechanical challenges or abstract narratives, they're protecting something they've come to value. This emotional investment in the world itself creates meaningful stakes that drive engagement and make victories feel genuinely triumphant. Our 76th fact reveals that campaigns become personal mythology. For players who participate in long-running campaigns, the stories that unfold become deeply personally meaningful. They remember not just what happened, but how it felt, the tension during crucial decisions, the elation of unexpected victories, the grief when beloved characters died, the satisfaction of seeing character growth over dozens of sessions. These memories take on mythic quality, growing richer through retelling, becoming part of the personal narratives players use to understand their own lives. The time when the party defeated the Lich, the moment when the rogue made an impossible leap, the session when the cleric's faith was tested and held firm. These aren't just game events, they become touchstones, reference points, stories players return to again and again because they carry emotional weight and meaning beyond the immediate context of play. Now, our 77th fact. Shared stories outlast individual characters. Characters retire, die, or get set aside when campaigns end. But the stories those characters participated in continue to exist in the memories of everyone at the table. Years later, former players reunite and reminisce about old campaigns. The fighter who held the bridge, the wizard's catastrophic misfire, the bard who talked the party out of impossible situations. These shared stories create bonds between players that persist long after the campaign's end. They're experiences that belong to the group, collectively, part of a shared history that strengthens relationships and creates lasting connections. The stories outlast the characters because they're not really about the imaginary people, they're about the real people who created those imaginary experiences together. Our 78th fact observes that fantasy RPGs turn play into memory making. Every session creates memories, moments of laughter, tension, triumph, creativity, surprise. Unlike many forms of entertainment that are passively consumed and quickly forgotten, role-playing games demand active participation, which creates stronger, more vivid memories. You don't just remember watching something happen, you remember making it happen or reacting to it or creating it collaboratively with friends. These memories accumulate over time, building a reservoir of shared experiences that define friendships and communities. The game becomes a framework for memory making, a structure that facilitates the creation of moments people will remember fondly for years or decades. Our 79th fact declares that the table becomes the canon. In published fantasy fiction, there's an official version of events, the canonical story that actually happened. In role-playing games, what happens at your table is the canonical version for your group. No external authority can overrule it. If in your campaign the elves allied with the dragons and together they reshaped the political landscape, then that's what happened fully and completely with as much validity as anything in any published setting. This ownership is powerful. Players aren't just consuming someone else's story, they're creating their own, and their version has absolute authority within the context of their game. The table becomes the source of truth, the place where reality is determined. This transforms players from audiences into authors, from consumers into creators. And finally, our 80th fact, fantasy RPGs endure because they are co-authored legends. At their best, role-playing games create stories that feel legendary, tales of heroes facing impossible odds, of worlds hanging in the balance, of ordinary people discovering extraordinary courage and capability. But unlike traditional legends passed down through generations, these are legends created collaboratively by everyone at the table. They're personalized, responsive to the specific people involved, flexible enough to incorporate everyone's contributions. They're legends that belong to the people who create them, that reflect their values and interests, that matter precisely because they emerged from shared imagination and collaborative effort. This combination, the epic scope of legendary tales with the intimate personalization of collaborative creation, is what makes fantasy role-playing games so enduring, so meaningful, so capable of capturing imaginations across generations. So, as you drift into sleep or simply rest in this peaceful state, carry with you this final thought. Fantasy role-playing games last because they offer something unique and precious, the chance to be co-authors of your own legends, to create stories that matter personally and profoundly, to share in the ancient human joy of gathering together to imagine, to pretend, to create worlds from nothing but words and dice and shared commitment to possibility. They endure because they tap into something fundamental about human nature, our need for story, for community, for agency, for wonder. And they'll continue to endure as long as people gather around tables, real or virtual, to ask that most powerful of questions: what happens next? Rest well, dreamer. May your own legends be rich and meaningful. May your tables be filled with creativity and joy. And may the worlds you imagine together be as vivid and lasting as any fantasy realm has ever been.